Welcome back to this series introducing Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. In this episode we're going to look at Chapter 7, where Dooyeweerd continues his analysis of the humanistic ground motive and its further development, which he describes in terms of romantic redirection. To understand this chapter, it is helpful to keep a number of distinctions in mind that Dooyeweerd returns to throughout without fully explaining. The first is the difference between a part and a whole. So consider a tree with its leaves, branches, trunk and roots. These are the parts that make up the tree. However, it makes sense to understand these parts in terms of the whole tree. It is the whole that has priority here, and this is characteristic of organic wholes. The branches are branches of the tree, and no longer really exist as branches once detached from the tree. Take a different example, a school made up of the teachers and students, the administrators and site staff. Here the emphasis falls in the opposite direction, and we think that the individuals that make up the school are more fundamental. After all, at the end of the day, the teachers and students and so on head home and continue to live their lives independently of the school. Well, things are a little more complicated because the school is not merely an aggregate of individuals. There is a broader purpose and institutional structure that binds the individuals together for the duration of the school day. On the issue of part and whole, it is possible to think about reality and understand reality primarily in terms of the whole. Then we could call this holism, although in fact Dooyeweerd tends to call it universalism, as in the universe being the whole. On the other hand, it is possible to understand reality in terms of the parts. This is sometimes called atomism, as in the basic elements that make up the universe. Dooyeweerd, however, calls this individualism. The second distinction to keep in mind is a little more tricky. Think again of the tree with its grey-brown branches and green leaves. It shares these features with many other trees. Or think of a school as a place that educates children. Again, it shares this feature with other schools. The greenness of the leaves on this tree are to some extent the same as the greenness of leaves on that tree. And the education of children that goes on in this school is to some extent the same as the education of children that goes on in some other school. These are universal features of trees and schools. This is where the confusion can kick in, because Dooyeweerd calls thinkers that emphasize these universal features that constitute what something is rationalists. They emphasize the sameness and universal order of things. However, this tree is in many ways very different from that tree, and this school is very different from the other school. They are each unique and individual, we would say. So once again, there's a bit of danger of confusion here because Dooyeweerd will speak in terms of irrationalism. So just to summarize, an emphasis on the whole, Dooyeweerd calls universalism, an emphasis on the parts, individualism, an emphasis on universal order of things, he calls rationalism, and an emphasis on the unique individuality of things, he calls irrationalism. In the previous chapter, the primary intellectual movement discussed was the Enlightenment, and this found its most significant expression in the French Revolution. It was the French Revolution, according to Dooyeweerd, that finally translated the individualistic notions in the humanistic theory of natural law into political reality. In this chapter, Dooyeweerd explores the reaction against the Enlightenment found in Romanticism, and the reaction provoked by the French Revolution in the Restoration period. Central to his argument is that throughout both the Revolution and the Counter-Revolution, humanism maintained the absolute spiritual leadership in Western culture. This is an important point because Dooyeweerd was part of the anti-revolutionary movement of Groven von Prinsterer and Abraham Kuyper, which saw in the French Revolution an intensification of anti-Christian principles. As always, one of Dooyeweerd's concerns is the spiritual discernment, to see that even when Western culture seems to more closely resemble or even embrace Christian themes, It does not mean that accommodation should be recommended. To be anti-revolutionary should not entail embracing the counter-revolution. Dooyeweerd summarizes his analysis of humanism in this chapter in the following way. The personality ideal began to emancipate itself from the influences of the classical nature motive in its mechanistic world picture. The personality ideal acquired a new and irrational form which assimilated and reinterpreted many familiar Christian motives in a humanistic fashion. Even prominent Christian thinkers and statesmen, Roman Catholic as well as Protestant, were misled by this and mistook the new spiritual movement as a dependable ally in their fundamental battle against the revolutionary principles. We shall attempt to sketch this new spiritual movement within humanism in terms of the inner dialectic of humanism's own ground motive. Now, the Enlightenment was characterized by the classical science ideal, which was a rationalistic approach, it focusing on the universal features of rational order, and this therefore precluded a proper recognition of the true individuality of things. While Kant had limited the science ideal to the phenomena, rationalism still dominated his understanding of the person. So despite his renewed emphasis on human freedom, Kant still understood the human self in terms of the moral law. Dooyeweerd writes that Kant's rigorous ethics of law left no room for recognizing the value of individual dispositions. With respect to the universal moral law, all people are merely indistinct individuals who lack real individuality. While this is an abstract view of the individual, it was nevertheless a focus on individuals and so a form of individualism which lacked the true idea of community. This means that the state is understood merely as an aggregate of individuals and marriage merely a contract for the mutual and lasting possession of each other's bodies. Romanticism rejected against this picture. For the Romantics, the rule for human conduct must find its origin in the full individuality of the self in one's individual dispositions. This led to an ethics of genius set against the bourgeois ethics. Humanism's turn to the other extreme, a turn that completely dismissed the validity of binding universal laws, led to dangerously anarchistic consequences, particularly in the area of sexual relationships. Friedrich Schlegel is mentioned in this context as someone who glorified a kind of free love involving the sexual surrender of a woman to a man out of spontaneous love, outside of any marriage bond. The individualistic view had started from the classical science ideal, which understood all complex natural phenomena in terms of their simplest elements in accordance with the natural scientific method. This individualistic view was rationalistic. It required that the components which were thought to be the basis for more complex phenomena were to be stripped of any irrational characteristic so that they could be grasped in clear and transparent universal concepts. Applied to society, this meant that humans as individuals, with their universal faculties of reason and will, stripped of all authentic individuality, were the components of society. Romanticism opposed this view of the humanistic personality ideal and replaced it with an irrationalistic conception. For Romanticism, the autonomous freedom of the human personality cannot be understood in terms of a universal, colourless individual constituted by rational, lawful relationships, but rather in terms of the fully individual disposition of a person. A person like Napoleon, for example, cannot be judged in terms of universal standards. However, the emphasis on both unique individuality against universal structures and the individual as an element free from the whole had anarchistic implications which were too much for most people. So irrationalistic romanticism needed to discover limits for the individual freedom of the autonomous personality, and this was found by replacing the universal law with an all-embracing community which would itself possess a uniquely individual disposition and personality. This allowed the free personality to express its individual inclination more fully, while also leading to an ideology of community. The all-embracing community that would act as a higher authority was found in the national community and its utterly individual national spirit. It was said that abstract individuals, instances of the general concept of a human being, do not exist. Rather, individual Germans, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Dutchmen do exist, and their individuality is determined by the individual character of the Volk to which they belong. So the move was made from the autonomous individual person to the autonomous individual community. Dooyeweerd wants to emphasize the humanistic origin of this community ideology, as it poses a danger for Christians keen to oppose the obvious atheism and individualistic rationalism of the French Revolution. It is tempting, for example, to point to organic motifs in the Bible, such as that God made humankind of one blood, to support a universalistic, community-oriented view. However, Dooyeweerd writes that those who take the biblical creation motive seriously will never be guided by the idea of an autonomous national spirit, which in its absolute individuality is its own law and standard. They will never view a temporal community as the totality of all human relationships, of which the other societal spheres are merely dependent parts. The principle of sphere sovereignty will resist any such overextension or absolutization of a temporal community at the expense of societal relationships which are non-communal in nature. Sphere sovereignty breaks through then the attraction of both individualism and universalism. The danger of thinking in terms of a national community that embraces the people is that it ignores the diverse social spheres within which individuals participate, and so elevates the nation to a religious level. What Dooyeweerd describes as the root community of humankind can only be found, in its restored sense, in Jesus Christ as the new Adam. This central religious community must not be looked for within the limited temporal spheres of society. So Dooyeweerd writes that only the spiritual root community in Jesus Christ bears a genuinely totalitarian character. Every other community ideology originates in the spirit of darkness. Dooyeweerd has so far focused on the personality ideal. Now he turns his attention to the science ideal. He wants to show that the humanistic understanding of science also underwent a transformation in line with the shifting dynamics of the humanistic ground motive. Rejecting the method of dividing complex phenomenon into its simplest elements, the new science ideal took its point of departure from the individual whole. The new universalism proceeded to understand the peculiar place and function of the parts in terms of the whole. To accomplish this shift of method, a new focus was given to history as a science that sought theoretical insight into what was individual and unique. The appearance this gave was that humanism had now overcome or broken through its dialectic between nature and freedom, science and personality. Dooyeweerd writes that at first sight, culture seems to be the free and autonomous product of an individual national spirit. But further reflection makes clear that this individual creative freedom has its reverse side in a hidden natural necessity. So whereas the French revolutionaries believed themselves free from history so that they could make a clean break and start from year zero, the historical way of thought brought to the fore the dependence of every national spirit upon its own individual past and upon its own tradition. This was the background to the idea of a destiny of a people. And this leads to historicism. So just as the classical science ideal absolutized the aspect of mechanical motion, so the historical science ideal absolutized the aspect of history. This was not restricted to human culture alone, but was also fundamental to an understanding of nature, which had its own natural history. The recent discovery of electricity further undermined the old mechanistic framework of science, so allowing the Romantics to see a gradual increase in the creative freedom within nature. So just as the classical science ideal actually came into conflict with the freedom motive that had given rise to it, So this new science ideal also came in conflict with the freedom motive. The historicistic way of thought would eventually cause an inner crisis, Dooyeweerd writes, within the humanistic worldview. In our day, he says, this crisis displays itself in the spiritual uprootedness of those who seek to live out of the humanistic ground motive. Dooyeweerd describes the shift to the universalistic overestimation of the community as reactionary. This needs to be understood in the light of his earlier discussion of historical development and the norm of differentiation in Chapter 3. In overestimating the community idea, it tends to look for a reversal of the differentiation of culture. The first unmistakable indications of genuine historical progress are to be found in the breaking up of the undifferentiated spheres of life, which embrace persons in all of their relations. In this regard, despite its revolutionary individualism and rejection of God's sovereignty, the French Revolution was a progressive force. However, this progress was not achieved without blemish and brought significant disharmony into cultural development. By only respecting free and autonomous individuals, it did not recognize the rights of the private, non-state communities in society. It had no feeling for historical continuity in culture and could not provide a stable foundation for governmental authority, which became the victim of the revolutionary consequences of the principle of popular sovereignty. The Restoration period brought new insight into historical development. However, it brought new dangers. In particular, its historicism encouraged a view of human society that excluded the acceptance of firm norms and clear limits between societal structures, and led to the new community ideology. Dooyeweerd regrets that in its fight against the humanistic principles of the French Revolution, Christians tended to side with the conservativistic or even reactionary elements of humanism, not realizing that these were equally opposed to an understanding working from out of the scriptural ground motive of creation, fall, and redemption.